So hello and welcome to our workshop this afternoon. My name is Dr. Samara Scully. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Psychology in Schools team, and I'm joined today by Annie Bryant, who is a trainee clinical psychologist, soon to be qualified clinical psychologist.
A couple of weeks, yes.
A couple of weeks, yeah, not very long to go. And what we are going to be talking about today is how we support our most vulnerable students in the classroom. So what we're hoping to cover in this session is we are going to briefly introduce ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, which many of you are probably familiar with. And we're just going to think briefly on their impact on children and young people. We're then going to start thinking about why relationships are the cornerstone of a therapeutic school. And for the second half, we're really going to focus on kind of how we build those relationships with children who kind of struggle to trust. And we're hoping that you will leave with a good sense of why this is so important in the classroom. So if we're just going to start with having a little bit of a think about what are adverse childhood experiences. So essentially, this term came from a big public survey that was carried out in the 1990s in the States. So there was 1,600 Americans were asked to think about their childhood, and they were asked to answer 10 questions. So of these 10 questions, 5 of them related to adverse experiences that had happened around them. So if they had experienced a difficult divorce of their parents, or if someone in their family had gone to prison. And then the other 5 questions were about abuse that was kind of directed at them. So if they had experienced emotional abuse or physical abuse. And for every question that they answered yes to, they were given a score of 1. So everyone was left with a score between 0 and 10. Now, what was really interesting about this study was that high ACE scores were associated with really significant mental and physical health outcomes. Generally, these outcomes tended to manifest around about middle age, and they identified links with things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, in addition to a significant link with mental health problems such as depression. Now, what we know in the UK, and what we know about ACEs in the UK is that half of all adults have experienced at least one form of adversity in their childhood or adolescence. And I think it's really important just to hold in mind that these figures were from prior to the pandemic, because we know that so many children and young people have been exposed to increases in domestic violence. We know the divorce rates have gone up. We know there are lots of families who are really struggling with poverty through the pandemic. And essentially what this means in practice within the school context is that in the average classroom in the UK, you will have at least 3 children who've been exposed to at least one adverse childhood experience. So for these children, we know that they are going to experience really significant difficulties with regulating their emotions. So there's a clinical psychologist called Karen Thraisman who writes and trains a lot in this area. And she uses, I think, this really helpful metaphor to kind of think about what the experiences might be like for some of these children. So she talks about them living in shark-infested waters. So what she suggests is that for those children who live in high ACE environments, they never know who is kind of swimming above them or who's swimming below them and what might happen. And actually for these children, what it means is that they are left in this really constant state of hypervigilance, because what developmental trauma does is it alters the structure of the developing brain. And actually, when we see consistent challenging behavior, the question we probably should be asking is, what happened to you, rather than what is wrong with you? Because many of these behaviors are underpinned by really tricky experiences that some of these children have had. And this can present in schools in so many different ways. You know, these are the young people who are often very easily distracted. They're very jumpy. They're very vigilant to what other people around them are doing. You know, it can also present as many of the things that are kind of illustrated in this picture. You know, it can present as anger or rage. We know many of these children have a very low frustration tolerance. They're often very suspicious and they find it very difficult to kind of trust other people. So there's lots and lots of ways that these difficulties can present in the young people in our care. So we're just going to do a Slido now. So I just wonder if you can just take a moment to think of the young people in your care and what difficulties they might have experienced during the pandemic. And which category do you think these experiences would fall into? I'm not sure if any of you, oh, that's great. Thank you so much to the 6 people who've registered. That's absolutely great. So poverty, divorce, parental mental health difficulties, neglect. I mean, it's across the board really, isn't it? Yeah. And we know that there has been a significant increase in parental mental health difficulties through the pandemic. It's been a really, really difficult year and a half for most people. And certainly I know many people who've gone through some really tricky relationship problems. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. So I guess this kind of takes us to thinking about how do we support these children to kind of manage the school environment. And this is a very beautiful quote from a psychiatrist in the States called Bruce Perry, who has done loads and loads of research into trauma in young people. So the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be able to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. And, you know, I think the really good news is that we know that adverse childhood experiences and the implications of having these experiences is not what Mary Meredith calls kind of a life sentence. So we know that if the child has enough protective factors, and the most powerful of these protective factors is access to what Bruce Perry calls buffering relationships. So what I mean by that is kind of high quality attuned relationships. And these relationships are so important to our young people, because what the research now shows is that high quality relationships in childhood and outcomes in later life, the link between those two things is even stronger than the link between high ACEs and poor outcomes. So essentially what this means is that relationships are the biggest resource that we have in terms of changing the trajectory for these young people. And I think, you know, what's really important to recognize is that this can be anyone. So, you know, it can be a parent or carer, but it also can be a receptionist, a teaching assistant, a teacher, a student support officer, a caretaker. It really doesn't matter. What matters is kind of that you're being human and you're offering this kind, non-judgmental response when a young person is really struggling to make good decisions. And, you know, I guess we need to then think about, you know, how do we build these relationships? You know, people often think that we need, you know, really specific training and we need loads of time to create meaningful relationships with vulnerable young people. And, you know, in some cases, this will be true, but for the majority of these young people, what builds strong, safe relationship is consistent, caring interactions with the adults that are in their environment. And, you know, for any of us working in schools, we have so much potential to support these children because, you know, we have it, you know, in our person to help them to feel kind of respected and rewarded and regulated. And I think, you know, there's this really nice phrase, again, from Karen Thraisman, and she talks about every interaction is an intervention. And essentially what this means is that it is the little things, so those micro moments that kind of hold the most power. So every time a child has a positive interaction with the adults around them, this interaction essentially becomes an intervention, because the more positive interactions a child has, the more these interactions become hardwired in the brain. And actually, these children can then kind of start to trust that there is such a thing as safe relationships in the world. And I think, you know, Bruce Perry sums this up really nicely. So what he says is, it is really not what you know, but how you are with these children that makes the difference for them. And I think, you know, I guess the question that is often asked around this is, you know, how on earth do I do this with like 30 children in my classroom and with all of the other kind of goals and responsibilities I have? But actually, I think what people like Bruce Perry and Karen Thraisman are saying is that it actually just takes milliseconds. You know, if you can give a child in your classroom a tiny glance as you're explaining, I don't know, the plan for the day, what this will do is it will leave that child with the feeling like you are kind of, you are paying attention to them. And, you know, there's lots of different ways you can do this on a daily basis. You know, one of the simplest ways to do it is, you know, you give, you know, how do you greet the young people when they're coming into your classroom? Are you kind of preoccupied with getting everything ready for the day? Or are you able to kind of say hello, use their name and welcome them into the classroom? Or, you know, you see a child in the corridor from your form class and you make eye contact with them for literally a millisecond, or you just give them a quick smile. Because what that young person is going to experience is, they've been recognized, they've been seen. And actually that is incredibly valuable. It's also just about kind of being interested in their lives, just asking them, you know, how was the weekend? Did you see the match? How's your mum recovering from her operation? And, you know, essentially, I guess what we want is kind of these repetitive, positive relational moments, because it's an accumulation of these tiny moments that make the difference over time. Because what's happening is these interactions are slowly rewiring a hypervigilant brain so that it starts to trust in relationships. It starts to trust in the idea that people can understand. And it also gives this sense of, you know, someone has got my back. And, you know, in a school environment, this is particularly important because, you know, we know when the brain is more relaxed and less hypervigilant, it is so much easier for that child to be able to engage in learning. And there's this concept of strategic relationship building. And, I'm sure most of you would agree that it is so much easier to be available and respond with children who are good at communicating, when they're responsive back. It's just human nature. But I guess, what we know is that it's the children that are the most difficult to engage that need our engagement most. So it's those children who kind of reject our attempts to engage with them that really need us the most. Because these, so for these students, for example, like being greeted when they come into the classroom, it's really important because over time, this is kind of what makes the difference. And it's absolutely recognized that this is hard. Empathy refuels based on the response of the other person. So when our attempts to kind of connect are repeatedly ignored, or we perceive them to be ignored, it is really hard to keep trying. And, what refuels our empathy is compassion. So when we have an understanding of why a young person might be behaving the way they are, maybe we have an understanding of their home life, or we know a little bit about their early experiences, this allows for more compassion, which allows for more empathy. And, I think it is incredibly difficult for school staff when they have very little information about the student's history and why they might be behaving in the way they are. So it's just a really important thing to hold in mind in terms of being able to keep yourself in that position of being empathic. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is extracurricular activity. So we know that this is a really big source of positive relationships because, I guess extracurricular activities tend to be slightly less formal. There's less children. There tends to be a little bit more time. So this kind of just makes it a little bit easier to kind of bond and create those long-lasting relationships. Now, sadly, what we do know is that many children who really need those relationships are the most unlikely to be involved in those extracurricular activities. But I think this is a real shame because of the relational value that these activities offer. And I think, now that we're kind of going back into the new school year, I'm hoping that this is something that we'll all be able to pay a little bit more attention to and hopefully facilitate a little bit more for some of these children. So we're just going to do another slide out now. And I just want you to take a moment and think about those children in your care that are the hardest to reach. And just have a think about, what is it that makes them so difficult to reach? They don't want to talk. Yeah, they don't want to talk. And I think that's really linked into their lack of safety and lack of experience with positive relationships. Fear of rejection. Yeah, absolutely. They really worry that if they open themselves up, that something bad might happen. The protective walls they put up around themselves. Yeah, and we're gonna talk a little bit later about something called the shame shield, which hopefully will be a helpful idea to think about that. Many of our children are non-verbal, so relying on alternative forms of communication or observing their behavior. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm imagining that person might be from a specialist school, very suspicious. They don't trust adults to be supportive. Yeah, and it makes sense, doesn't it? If you haven't had those experiences of adults being supportive in the past, it takes a very long time to kind of build up that trust. They walk away, they're physically very hard to reach. Yeah. And I think, it's hard. It's really hard as a teacher or a TA or someone working with children, it is very hard to kind of go back again and again and again when they kind of walk away and they shut down and they don't kind of let you in. It takes a lot of strength and resource on the behalf of staff. Loyalty to parents, yeah, absolutely. I think for many of these children, there's a lot of fear about what it might mean if they kind of open up and become attached to kind of some other people. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. So I just wanted to kind of touch on the difference between shame and guilt. So, you know, we know that children need to be contained and everyone needs to be safe. And we absolutely recognize that within a school setting or any setting, really, boundaries are essential. But I guess there's a way of doing it, particularly for children with high ACEs. And we just need to ensure that we are trying our very best to maintain a relational approach. So, you know, we all know that boundary setting is difficult. You know, none of us like being told what to do. But when we make the boundary about the behavior and not about the person, what we are inducing is guilt as opposed to shame. So even though they can often sound incredibly similar, guilt and shame are very different things. So when we feel shame, we tend to kind of locate all of the difficulties in ourselves. And what happens is it kind of makes us want to move away from other people. It makes us want to hide because it feels so painful. Whereas guilt is a much more pro-social emotion. So, you know, what guilt does is it kind of drives us towards other people and we want to make right what's gone wrong. So, you know, when we experience guilt, our cognitive processes is something around, you know, I did something bad. And psychologists kind of call this a pro-social emotion, whereas shame is much more about I am bad. And it's much more of an anti-social emotion because it tends to pull us away from people. And, you know, for any of us who kind of experience a boundary that involves shaming, it's really painful. And what happens is it results in, and I'm sure this feels familiar to you, it results in lots of defensiveness and the boundary not being accepted. And this is particularly relevant for those children who struggle with relational poverty and have those high ACE scores. Because, you know, so often children with high ACE scores, they're already kind of really steeped in shame. So it's just super important that we're mindful of how we approach boundary setting and just try and ensure that we're kind of inducing guilt rather than shame. And the reason why this is so important, and I'm hoping this will kind of talk to some of the comments you made on the previous Slido about kids kind of shutting down or getting defensive, because essentially what happens when children are exposed repeatedly to shame is they develop what Kim Golding calls a shield against shame. So what Kim's research shows is that young people develop a shield against shame directly because of the fact that shame is so painful. So, you know, and you'll recognize this, you're going to know this scenario where, you know, something's happened, you know, you might have seen it happen. You might even have like camera evidence and the child will still be adamant that they didn't do it. And actually, this can be extremely frustrating unless you're able to understand this, because essentially the shield of shame is how vulnerable children protect themselves. So they generally will take kind of one of four positions. So they might deny it and say, you know, I never did anything. You know, they might blame whoever else is around. So, you know, even though you've seen them do it, they might say it wasn't me, it was him. And they might minimize what they've done, or they might get really dysregulated and become just incredibly difficult to reach. And I'm guessing, you know, if you took a moment to think about your most vulnerable or tricky students and you kind of asked yourself the question, does the shame shield fit for them? the answer will probably be yes for at least some of those students. So it's a really, really helpful concept to hold in mind. So I'm going to hand over to Annie now, who's going to talk you through some really practical applications of some of these ideas.
Thanks very much, Tamara. So as Tamara said, so for the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on an idea called connection before correction, which some of you may have heard of before. It's an idea developed by Kim Golding. And it's basically an idea of there being kind of two hands of discipline. So we're thinking about this kind of approach is really essential for working with children with high ACE scores, given what we understand about their relational difficulties and things that Tamara's been talking about. And it's thinking about how to engage with a young person when they are really distressed or really dysregulated, or perhaps behaving in a way that is really challenging, but we know that they might have experienced adversity or even trauma in their life. So the two hands of discipline are about it being really, really essential to start any approach with a young person with connection. So hand one, kind of reaching out to that young person with warmth, with a nurturing approach, and with a sense of I see you and I'm here for you. And then hand two is following that connection stage with then providing the structure and boundaries and consequences if necessary for whatever behaviour that young person has displayed. So I'll go through the different steps that you need to follow to be able to do connecting before correcting with those young people. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So firstly, it's about noticing the students for which this may be helpful. So as Tamara said, what you're going to be looking out for in your young people is the knowledge that you have about them and their kind of home life and family life, to think about which children in your classes may well have high ACE scores. Because as I said, this connection before correction is going to be really important in terms of making meaningful progress and building great relationships with those young people. But having said that, this approach is also helpful for other children within the classroom. So for example, if a child is really hyperactive or really aggressive in the classroom, and regardless of ACE scores, this approach is really helpful. So it's just thinking about trying to identify when someone in your classroom may be really struggling with the environment and that you might need to do some connecting with them in order to be able to help them through that. Next slide, please. So we'll just start with a Slido based on that. So what kinds of things do you notice when young people in your care are struggling? So this could be noticing that a child is having a particularly bad day, or it could be particular patterns of behaviour that you see in some people in your classes who are really struggling in that environment. What kinds of things might you notice? Conflicts at playtime, yeah, more aggressive behaviour, definitely. So relational conflicts with peers or with staff would definitely be a real indicator. Aggressive and disruptive behaviour, yeah. Being withdrawn is an interesting one. We'll come back to that a bit later. So we've got the kind of difference between withdrawn and kind of isolated behaviour and then really kind of outward facing behaviour. Yeah, behaviour that challenges that can escalate very rapidly. Disengaged, irritable, unable to engage. Yeah, definitely. So these would all be really helpful signs that someone within your classroom was really struggling and may well need some more support from you. Fantastic. Thank you. Can I get the next slide, please? So once you've noticed that someone in your class may well be really struggling, it's actually the best place to start is to think about yourself and where you are. So an adult who is really dysregulated, so whether you're really cross with a young person for something they've just done, whether you're upset after seeing something or hearing something, whether you're just really stressed because you are also having a really bad day, if you are in a dysregulated state, it's not going to be possible for you to help regulate a dysregulated child. So the first step is to kind of ask yourself the question, am I regulated? Am I in a position where I can be open and engaged with this young person and help them to feel safe and to be able to start making sense of what's going on? So partly that's about thinking in the moment, what do you need to help yourself be regulated in the classroom? But also it's a wider point about when working with young people, particularly with kind of high A scores, it can be really emotionally distressing, especially when there are lots of young people you are working with who are really struggling. That can have a real emotional drain on people who work with young people. And so it's important that you take care of your own well-being and ensure that your kind of bucket of positive well-being is as full as it can be. Whether that means kind of taking some time with colleagues during the working day to chat about how things are going, to get some support and advice, or outside of work, connecting with friends and family, doing hobbies that you enjoy, eating well and sleeping well, and those kind of things to make sure that you're in the best position you can be to be well regulated in the classroom, to be able to help regulate a child who you're looking after. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to ask people, what do you do that helps you to regulate in school? So if you were having a particularly bad day or dealing with a distressing or difficult incident, what would help you to make sure that you were as regulated as possible or as calm and engaged as possible to engage with your young people? So I'm just thinking about tips for what helps to regulate you or to regulate other colleagues. So you might have examples of how you've helped other colleagues kind of be calm and regulated in certain situations. Yes, keeping hydrated and nourished, absolutely. So looking after your physical well-being is extremely important. Yeah, so you've got the right energy, your brain's working how it should. Taking a break, absolutely. Going for a walk at lunchtime, that's a really good idea. So being in a different space, getting some breathing space, some fresh air. Talking to colleagues, sharing feeling with colleagues, definitely. It's so important, particularly if you're working in environments, as I said, where lots of the young people you're working with have really, really difficult experiences going on. You really need to rely on your colleagues for that sort of supervision and support so that you can be as regulated as possible with those young people. And work-life balance, it's really important for anyone in any role. But for young people with high A scores, they really need the people working with them in an educational setting to be as kind of prepared to support them as they can. Fantastic, thank you. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay, so moving on to thinking about the young person's regulation. So this is a kind of a really key bit of theory, really, to understanding why it's so important to do connection before correction. And so we use this model developed by Dan Siegel called the window of tolerance to help us understand kind of levels of regulation in young people in the classroom. So the window of tolerance is basically 3 zones of emotional regulation. Now the green zone in the middle is the zone where we can tolerate our emotions. Our emotions don't feel too overwhelming. We can kind of go up and down in our emotions, might feel a little bit anxious or a little bit stressed, but we're able to tolerate it. And so we're in a zone where we can learn, we can play, we can be creative, we can connect with others. And for some people, that green zone is really wide. So they can tolerate quite big changes in emotions and it's tolerable and they can cope and they can still be engaged and learn in the classroom. For other people, particularly young people with high A scores or experiences of trauma, their green zone may well be much narrower. So they've got much less capacity for dealing with fluctuations of emotions. And so it's easy for them to become dysregulated. And so when a child becomes dysregulated, what you're likely to see in the classroom is probably them moving into the red zone. And so when they're moving into the red zone, effectively their brain has identified something that has activated their threat system. So they have been scared by something or angered by something, and that fight or flight response has been set off, sending adrenaline running around their bodies, their heart's pumping fast, they may be presenting as anxious or panicked, they may be presenting with kind of aggressive or self-destructive behavior. And effectively, that's their brain's way of trying to keep them safe in what they're perceiving as a threatening situation. So their brain is trying to either get them away from or fight something that is really distressing them. And so they are hyper aroused in that red zone. And that's really overwhelming for them. And then the kind of opposite side of that, the blue zone, is when a child goes from the green zone, but they actually become hypo-regulated. So what happens there is, again, actually the brain's attempt to keep that young person safe, but instead of becoming hyper-aroused, it almost shuts down everything that it doesn't need to do. So you see this in particularly young people who have been through experiences of trauma. One of the things that the brain can do to adapt to traumatic situations is to basically dissociate and shut off, so that that young person can feel distanced and numb from something really distressing that's happening. And so in the classroom, this might present as a young person feeling completely disconnected from what's going on. So it's sort of beyond daydreaming. They're really zoned out. They're really not kind of conscious of what's happening, really disconnected, perhaps finding it hard to put words together or to even focus on what's going on. And so both the red zone and the blue zone are levels of emotion regulation where that young person feels really unsafe. And so their brain is doing something to try and keep them safe in that distressing situation. And when the brain is trying to keep them safe, because it's so focused on keeping them safe and getting away from that threatening situation, it's not functioning properly in a cognitive sense. So when a child is outside of their green zone, they're not able to learn, they're not able to focus, and they're not able to have kind of rational conversations with you or the staff that are around them. And this model really makes it clear that in order to work with young people who are really dysregulated or with high ACE scores, we need to help them to be regulated enough to be in that green zone, to be able to engage with us and to be able to kind of build relationships and confidence and to solve problems such as behaviour that they might be displaying that you need to help them out with. Next slide, please. So this is just a nice diagram that again makes that point that for a young person who's really dysregulated, perhaps they're kind of throwing things and shouting in the classroom, they've got really angry about something, but trying to go straight to reasoning with them is not going to connect because they are in that red zone. They are not able to have rational conversations. So what we need to do is help that child to regulate and calm that fight or flight response, to help them feel that they can relate to you, to feel safe with you. And then once they're back into that green zone and connected with you, then they can do that reflecting on their behaviour, learning from mistakes perhaps, and having an opportunity to talk to you about what that was like for them and what they found so distressing. Next slide, please. So related to that, so what are some of the things that you are perhaps already doing to support your students when they become dysregulated? So this is likely to be when they are in the red zone, so fight or flight response and hyper aroused. But it could also be that there are some young people you work with who become dissociated at times. How would you help to support them to get into that green zone? Yes, absolutely. Sensory-based activities and or movement breaks. Brilliant, yeah. It's on my list on the next slide. Going for a walk outside, yes, absolutely. So movement again, and going outside is again a sensory experience. Also giving a change of location. Physical activity, games, yes, so a sort of distracting and enjoyable activity. Ensuring they are safe, that's a really good point actually, because When children are really dysregulated, especially in that red zone, they may well be displaying some behaviour that is risky to themselves or others. And as I said, they're not able to do that reasoning and kind of logic themselves. They need that responsible adult such as yourselves to help make sure that they are safe whilst they're in that red zone, and then support them to calm down. Calming breaks, absolutely. So breathing exercises, movement, distraction with own interest. That's a good point. Yeah, so distraction with things that you know that young person likes or is interested in. Having a drink, sensory activity. Fantastic, that's all really helpful. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant. So some of these things will look familiar. So when we're thinking about supporting students to get back into the green zone, it will be sort of dependent on whether they are in that red zone or that blue zone. So movement is particularly important for quite often the blue zone. So when children are in that blue zone, they're hypo-aroused. So they actually need some sort of stimulating activity to get them back into the present moment. And so movement, whether that's some gentle stretches, if that's all they can tolerate, taking them out for a walk, going for a run or jumping around or something, can help to kind of wake up that activity and to bring them out of that dissociative state. Equally, for children who are in the red zone, movement can be really calming. So again, some stretches or just going for a slow walk. Breathing is really important, as some of you mentioned. So breathing is particularly important in terms of calming that fight or flight response when young people are in the red zone. So particularly when young people are encouraged to take a deep breath in through their nose, perhaps to hold it for a second or two, and then blow it out through their mouths really slowly with a longer out breath than in breath. And actually, when a young person does that for a while with longer out breaths, it actually sort of tricks the fight or flight response to calm down and to slow down some of that adrenaline that's running around the body. There's plenty of breathing exercises on kind of apps and YouTube videos as well, if you wanted some kind of practical examples to show to young people to help them. But simply breathing in through their nose and out through their mouth for slightly longer will be really helpful. Grounding exercises are things that help to give a person a sense that they are in the present moment, to remind them where they are, to kind of bring them back down to what's happening now. And again, that could be helpful whether a young person is in the red zone or the blue zone, actually. And sensory-based activities are really important for that, which a few people mentioned, which is great. So one thing that we like to suggest is called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. And it just goes through the 5 senses, asking a young person to notice kind of where they are at the moment. So we would ask them to name 5 things that they can see. If that's very easy for them, they could name 5 things they can see of a particular colour, which makes them have to focus a little bit more in detail on what's going on around them. We'd then ask them to name 4 things that they can hear wherever they are, 3 things that they could feel, and that could be the ground under their feet, their seat on their back, perhaps their t-shirt on their shoulders. 2 things that they can smell. If they can't smell anything in the room, you could encourage that young person to imagine their favourite smells that they really like, or you could find something that has a really nice smell for them to smell. And then finally, 1 thing that they can taste. And again, if there's nothing immediately there that they can eat, or a sweet that they can have, or a sip of drink, then ask them to imagine their kind of favourite taste. You can also do kind of specific grounding exercises using different senses. So if you know a young person has a particular smell that they really like, it's finding a way to use that smell when they're in that state of dysregulation to help calm them down. So I once worked with a young lady who had a significant trauma history, and she would quite often get dissociative experiences. And she started to use a particular hand wash that smelt like honey, I think it was, whenever she started to dissociate. Because the smell of honey was associated with a really positive memory from her childhood. And so when she felt she was starting to kind of zone out and slip into that blue zone, she would go and wash her hands really slowly with nice warm water to kind of wake her up a little bit with that nice smell. So it's finding something that works well for that young person. And even talking to them perhaps when they are regulated, so before they have a moment that's really distressing, and thinking, what could we do or what could we plan to do if you become really distressed, whether that's a sensory activity or breathing, for example. It's also important just being with that young person. So when they're feeling really, really distressed, as I said, whether they're in the red zone or the blue zone, they're likely to be feeling unsafe. It's likely that a sense of loss of safety or a sense of threat was what kind of sent them into that zone in the first place. So by you just being with them and reassuring them that you're there and you're there to support them and there to keep them safe, that may well be enough to help them kind of move back down towards that green zone and feel that they are in a safe place again. And validating how they feel, that's something we're going to come on to next. But all of these things are things that need to be developed and practiced over time. There might be some things that work well, there might be some things that don't work quite so well. So it's about, like I said, perhaps talking to the young person when they are feeling quite calm and thinking about this together, or thinking with other people in their system, whether that's parents or other teachers in the school that you can talk to about how can you best help them to get back into the green zone. Next slide, please. So thinking a bit more about kind of validating and empathizing with how that young person might be feeling. So a good phrase for this is to get curious before you get furious. And effectively, this is the idea of kind of wondering aloud with that young person. So what we're trying to do when we're trying to bring a young person into the green zone is to help them make a bit of sense of how they might be feeling and to empathize with how difficult that might be for them. So for example, if a young person is getting really, really angry or really, really anxious in the classroom, you could perhaps say, I'm wondering if this is particularly difficult for you because of that kind of sirens that we heard outside earlier. And I know that can be quite triggering for you. Or perhaps if one of your young people is refusing to do their work, rather than getting cross with them first or saying, if you're not going to do your work, then this consequence will happen. Perhaps you could say something like, I'm wondering if getting back into schoolwork after the summer holidays is really tricky for you. I know you've had a long time off and it can be hard to get back into the swing of things. Or I know that it's been difficult for you to sleep recently. I'm wondering if you're feeling quite tired and this maths lesson just feels like a bit too much today. So what the young person will experience when you wonder aloud with them is partly that someone is trying to understand what it's like to be them, and also perhaps giving them words to how they might be feeling that they might not have recognized before or understood before. For young people, especially young people with high ACE scores, emotions can be really confusing and can feel as if they come up almost out of the blue. And so when a trusted adult makes that sort of connection for them or wonders aloud to them, it can help give them a language for explaining their own experiences and feelings. And again, as Tamara was talking about, it's practicing doing this over and over again, wondering aloud with them about how they might be feeling, to build that trust and that relationship with them, so that they begin to trust that you know them well and you are there for them, and that they can have confidence that if they become dysregulated, someone is going to get it and someone is going to be there for them. Next slide, please. Okay, so can you think of a time that you have managed to stay in a curious position when a student in your class was having a hard time? And what was your experience of this? So is this something that you find easy to do? Is this something that can be tricky? Have you tried being curious with a young person? How was it received? Just any comments that people have would be really helpful. Any comments on that one? If not, we can move on. I know it's a slightly longer question. Okay, let's move on to the next slide because we've only got about 10 minutes left. Okay, so being empathetic and accepting towards young people, whilst it's really essential, particularly when working with young people with high ACE scores, it's not easy. If a young person has become really distressed or really challenging in your classroom, it's not necessarily going to be easy for your natural instinct to be empathetic or accepting. You may well feel angry sometimes, even scared, depending on how that young person is behaving. But what we're trying to say is making sure that connection and this acceptance and empathy is really at the forefront of your mind when you're working with these young people, because we want to be giving them a sense that you are trying to get it, you are trying to support them. And sort of related to what Tamara was saying earlier, we're not trying to condone inappropriate behaviour specifically. We don't want them to feel ashamed of how they're behaving. We want to show them what we're trying to understand what it's like to be them. You're trying to put yourself in their shoes and trying to help them to feel seen and understood, even if that has to be followed with some kind of boundary setting or correction. Next slide, please. So here are just a few more ideas of what this might look like in practice. So some ways that you can kind of show that you are being empathetic or at least trying to understand. So you might say, I notice that you are feeling anxious, or I notice you're feeling quite annoyed with what's happening. You can wonder, using your own information about what's going on in that young person's life, you can wonder about perhaps this is a really tricky week for you. I wonder if, the fact that it's Dad's birthday tomorrow and you won't be able to go and visit him is really making you quite upset or annoyed today. So you can use your knowledge of what's going on for them and wonder aloud, as we talked about earlier. And also just to empathise that this is really hard for the young person. And that can range from an extremely upsetting experience that's going on in their life, or even just being able to engage in the classroom. So we know children with high ACE scores may well have so much going on outside school that even being able to sit down and do one piece of work might be extremely difficult for them in terms of concentration, in terms of effort. So recognising that it can be really hard just day to day for some of these young people. You can also show that you understand that the particular thing they're finding difficult is difficult. So whether that's moving from one activity to another or starting school again after the summer holidays. And also recognising how much that young person might be managing. So you've already managed so much this week, or you're doing so well with managing being back at school after this difficult thing happened. Next slide, please. So once you've done that connecting with the young person and helping to bring them into that green zone, then hopefully they're in a position that you can then do the correction if there is kind of behaviour to address or incidents that you need to address with them. And boundaries are really containing. We do know that children do need boundaries. It can be actually particularly important for children with high ACE scores because they may well have lives outside of school that are so chaotic and unpredictable that actually having boundaries and clear rules and consistent boundaries put in at school can be quite containing and calming for them. So boundaries give young people a sense of safety. It also teaches them that no matter how they are feeling in the future as an adult, there will be consequences to certain behaviour if they, for example, break a law. But what's really important when working with vulnerable children is making sure that that connection process has come first before doing the correction. Because as Tamara was saying, in terms of thinking about shame, we need to make sure that we've connected with and understood that young person so they feel seen and they feel regulated before they are able to rationally think about the boundaries that they may have crossed and potentially any consequences of behaviour. So it's much easier for a young person to tolerate and understand boundaries being put in place once they've had that connection put in place first. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of the last step of the connection before correction process, and then we'll sum up. So in any relationship with young people, there will be ruptures to that relationship, whether it's a particular argument or disagreement, whether it's an incident that has meant that that young person has been excluded or given a detention. But what's extremely important for vulnerable children is that they learn that there can be ruptures to relationships, but that they will be repaired. And again, that's potentially something that they may not be experiencing outside of school. And so you're in a position to be able to show to that young person that even though something really difficult has happened, it has not affected the fact that you are still there to support them. You still like them as a person, and you're still going to be there for them tomorrow. So again, that's about kind of checking where you're at, checking your own regulation. And even if on the day when something really difficult has happened, you don't feel able to do that, it's perhaps ending the day with saying something like, we're okay, I'm not bothered about this anymore, tomorrow's another day. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So again, it's thinking about, you might not like the behaviour that they're displaying, but you do still like that young person as an individual. And you may well be the only adult that is making that effort to try and show them that, and to try and make them feel seen and helped and supported. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarise the key messages, and then we'll do a couple of Slidos, and then we've got some resources for people at the end. So I think one of the ways to sum up, I guess the kind of key point that we're making is again a quote from Bruce Perry, which is, all parts of our brain are malleable. The key is reaching the parts of the brain with enough repetition to create change. So effectively what he's saying there is, even for young people who have had really chaotic or traumatic or difficult early lives, which may well have impacted on lots of parts of their brains, so their attention system or their emotion regulation systems, with therapeutic dosing of positive and trusting relationships, even with small numbers of adults or small kind of doses of relational input, we can make meaningful change to the young person's brain and to their life. But again, as we've said before, it's not easy. So working with vulnerable children is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. It's about repetition of showing that young person that you care and that you are there for them, and practicing those connection before correction tools as well. It will take time, and it will take practice, and it may not always work. There may be some situations that feel really unmanageable. But what's important for the young person is that having even one person who sees you and believes in you can create fundamental change for their trajectory in life. So as I've said before, you may be the one person in that child's life who's making this effort to try and support them in the best way and in a trauma-informed way. And also, it's really important to recognise that to be able to do this work, whether as an educator or a clinician, we really need to prioritise our own self-care and make sure that we are in the best position possible to be regulated and calm, to be able to help out a young person to become regulated themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've got 1 minute to spare, which is brilliant. So if people wouldn't mind filling in this Slido just to see whether people found this training session helpful. And then, as I said, we've got one more Slido, and then I will share some resources. Great, thank you. Feedback is really helpful for us in thinking about running these sessions in future. Thank you. And if people wouldn't mind just jotting down what are the 2 things that you are going to take away from this session. And as I said, that's helpful in us thinking about what to keep in or include if we were to run this session again in future. Shark-infested waters and hypervigilance, yeah, really, really helpful ideas. Shame shield, absolutely. Anyone else? And then connection before correction, yeah, regulating first. Fantastic. Thank you, that's great. Thanks, everyone. So I'll just summarise some other resources that people can look at if they are interested. So we've noted down a couple of books by Bruce Perry there, which is probably no surprise Tamara and I are quite big fans of. So they're both really, really readable and accessible books. So Bruce Perry is a child psychiatrist. The first book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, he goes through kind of case studies of different young people he's worked with and what he learned about kind of developmental trauma and how to kind of heal developmental trauma in a relational way. And then he recently published a book with Oprah Winfrey as well called What Happened to You, which again thinks about the impact of trauma on children, but also on adults. There's a YouTube series featuring Bruce Perry, which is a series of a few kind of 8-minute long clips, which is called Stress, Trauma and the Brain, Insights for Educators. So they're very worth a listen if you're interested. And then Beacon House is a developmental trauma organisation in the UK. They have some really fantastic resources, and they have a document called Becoming a Trauma Sensitive School Resources Bank, and that's got all kinds of links to books and resources and training that are relevant to working in a trauma sensitive way in schools. I'd really recommend having a look through those. And then there is also an organisation called Trauma Informed Schools, and they are a UK organisation that provide specific training for schools or senior leadership teams on working in trauma informed ways, and they run conferences and things like that. So if you were really interested in your school becoming more trauma informed in its way of working, then I would look up their website too. So thank you very much everyone who has stuck with us till the end. We will be sending around the slides and putting up the recording as well, I think, onto YouTube at some point.
That's great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you all have a good transition back into school and you have a good month of September. All right, take care. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.